Hey kids, and welcome to today's lesson. I hope you guys are all keeping well and keeping safe and you're able to keep cool during these hot summer days. I know I'm doing the best that I can, so I hope that you are too. Now, with that, let's do a little review of what we've learned so far. If you remember last week, we started a new series where I'll be talking about some of my favorite stories from the Bible, why I like those stories so much, and what we can learn from those stories. Last week, we talked about Moses parting the Red Sea and what it must have been like to stand there and see these two giant walls of water kind of just be created and split apart, creating a piece of land for the Israelites to walk through. I said it was one of my favorites because I like to imagine being there and seeing those two giant walls and that path created. I also like to imagine seeing the fish kind of just swim around in these walls of water and being awestruck at what I have seen. And if you remember, we talked about that God is always with us, even when it feels like he might not be, or even when it feels like we're kind of backed into a corner and there's really not much we can do. We learned that God is there with us, protecting us and watching over us and keeping us safe as his people, which is pretty cool if you ask me. And that's why it's one of my favorite stories. Oh, hey Henry, what's up? You missed last week's story. Well, I don't think that's my fault. You slept through it. Now that I think about it, I don't remember seeing you at all last week. Yeah, well, hey, you're awake now, so you can listen to this story. It's a good one. You're gonna want to sit and listen to this one. You also liked last week's story after hearing about it? Some of your family was there? That's pretty cool to think about. What did they do? They swam and they slept. All right, well, how about you go stay awake and sit down and I'll talk to you about today's story. It's a pretty good one. I think you'll like it, you little goofball. No, you can't bite my cheek as a snack. All right, well, Henry's going to go sit down and I'll continue with today's lesson. You want to say bye to the kids, Henry? Again, that is hippo for goodbye. Alrighty. Let's get on with today's story then as Henry goes and sits down. Alrighty. So this week's story comes from a book in the Old Testament called 1 Samuel. And it's a story that many of us may be familiar with, and it has a character in it that many of us may also know or be familiar with. This week's story involves a man named David, who you may have heard of being talked about throughout the Old Testament. He's one of the kings of Israel, which is kind of cool to talk about, but that's not the story we're going to be focusing on today. Today's story, and one of my favorite stories, is the story of David and Goliath. Some of you may know this already, some of you may not. So, let's dive in. So, at the time of this story, David was only a shepherd and still probably about a teenager, and wasn't a king yet. He took care of his father's sheep and animals and watched over them. That was part of his daily duties and part of his daily routine as a shepherd. He was still pretty young at this point and not as strong as his older brothers who were serving in King Saul's army. At this point in David's story, the nation of Israel is battling a nation called the Philistines. And at this point, they were in a bit of a standoff. You had the Israelites on one side standing on a mountain over here, kind of. And on the other side, you had the Philistine army standing on another mountain over here with a valley in between them, keeping them separated. Now, as this standoff happened, each morning there was a Philistine named Goliath who would come forward to challenge the Israelites to a battle one-on-one. It seems pretty straightforward and pretty simple. But the thing was, he was so tall and so big that no Israelite wanted to challenge him because they feared that they would be defeated and they would lose, which is important to know for the next few sentences. So the challenge was that if Goliath won, the Israelites would become the Philistines' servants. But if an Israelite was able to defeat Goliath, the Philistines would become the Israelite servants. And yeah, because he was so big, no Israelite wanted to challenge him and be defeated, causing the Israelites to lose, which no one really wanted to be responsible for, and no one thought that they could beat Goliath. So a lot of pressure in facing this challenge. One day when David's dad told him to go visit his brothers and deliver some food to them, he heard Goliath issuing this challenge. David, to everyone's surprise, accepted this challenge after talking with some of the soldiers and hearing them not really want to fight or do anything. So David accepted the challenge, but was met with some resistance from King Saul because he was so young and so inexperienced in battle. Eventually, the King Saul agreed, and David went into battle with his staff, a few smooth round stones, and a sling. A few moments before, he tried wearing the king's armor, but he couldn't move and couldn't do anything, so he just went in what he was comfortable with. Now, as David approached Goliath, Goliath laughed and insulted David because Goliath was expecting a brave, big, buff soldier, not just some little teenage shepherd boy. But David stood there and he stood defiant. And so the battle began, and as Goliath was approaching David to attack him, David took one of these smooth stones, put it in his sling, gave it a few good twirls, and launched at Goliath, landing the stone right into Goliath's forehead, causing him to fall and be defeated. Now, this was a huge thing, because then David stood victorious over Goliath, and the Israelites went over to battle the Philistines and capture them, having the Philistines become the Israelite servants, just kind of like what Goliath said would happen. So, this is one of my favorite stories for a bit of a different reason. Because when I was a kid, growing up about 15, 16, 20 years ago, sometime between then, I would watch the VeggieTales version of this, of Dave and the Giant Pickle, as it was called. It was one of my favorite videos to watch, and I had it almost memorized, I think. If you asked my parents how much I liked it, they would say that I copied the actions of some of the characters in the video, and I would say some of the lines from the video, and I just really enjoyed watching the story and watching it play out. It was one of my favorite VeggieTales videos to watch. And it's one of those stories that no matter how many times it gets told or how it gets told, I hear it, and it's just very memorable. And it's one of those stories that we all remember and we can all take with us. We might even hear it mentioned in like sports or some competition where it's David versus the Goliath, the big team that's doing super well and has already a really good shot at winning the trophy versus the smaller, less experienced team that's put up a good fight to get here, and no one really expects them to win. And we say that, or we see that a lot in today's world. Now, what's cool is that this story shows us what courage looks like and what it looks like when we do that with God, when we know that God is with us and we know that God will be there with us and can give us courage. Even when it seems like an impossible task or something that isn't in our favor, like David defeating Goliath, if we trust God and know that He is with us, He will help us in all situations. And that's really cool, if you ask me, knowing that God is there to help us, kind of like we talked about last week, how God's there with us through everything, and how if we trust in Him and know that He's with us, we can accomplish so much. So yeah, David and Goliath is one of my favorite stories. It's just one of those stories that is so memorable and is told so many times, and it never gets boring. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to pray, and then you guys can get on with your day. So let's bow our heads together and pray. Dear God, we thank you for today, and yeah, we thank you that you are with us, and that when we have our trust in you, and that when we are working for you, that you will help us accomplish our tasks and help us defy the odds when they don't seem in our favor. I pray you be with these kids as they go about their days and weeks in the summer. Pray this in your name. Amen. All right, kids, I'll see you around, and take care.